So, good evening, and welcome to Martin Henn. I am very excited, and I'm also delighted to have you here, and that is thanks to very much to Mirko Becker, who sends his greetings. Last year, after the end of the semester, Mirko got invited to be part of the DRX, which is a unique research initiative by the architectural firm Henn, where Martin Henn is the third generation to basically lead the firm. It was founded by his grandfather in 1979. Martin's father took over, same year as you were born, you told me. And
grandfather was a bit earlier.
That's right. And Martin is today head of design for this firm that sits in Berlin. It works all over the globe and has no less than 350 employees, 2 offices in China, amongst others. And of course, in Germany, you sit both in Berlin and in München. And DRX was then an initiative to do research. Mirko was invited to take part, and he in turn recruited a small group of people from the architecture class to be part of the DRX that summer. And that was the beginning of, which ends just for now, to this evening. It will continue, with Martin being here to speak about research, architecture, design. And I think it's most remarkable that you actually managed to do something like DRX, but also that, as I understand it, to have a devotion to research in a professional setting that obviously has an enormous pressure in terms of time, budgets, and it is also at the time when it continues to be highly fashionable for architectural firms all over the place to claim that they're doing research, to emphasize the value of research to their practice, and every so often it comes across as being a fairly hollow claim. I think DRX will, and I am in admiration of it. I think it is valuable. I think it's extremely valuable, in fact, and I think it's also extremely valuable complementary thing to what one can do in academia. So I'm very excited about your lecture, Martin. It is also to be said, Martin did his architectural training at the University of Stuttgart, and then at the ETH in Zurich, where some of us were last week. And then he went to New York and did his postgraduate training at Columbia, studying with, amongst others, Carl Chu. And I think for those of you who know, for instance, the work of, for instance, Carl Chu, you also know that that's already a daring step to make, because Carl Chu sits, at least as I know his work, at a somewhat distant, has a certain distance to what I presume would be the normal activities in an office like Henn. But I do think it witnesses also a willingness to expose oneself to basically ideas and practices that are, as exemplified by Carl Chu's work, extremely valuable to architecture, even when they're not eminently recognizable for their immediate impact. Martin, we're very excited to have you here. Very excited to hear your talk. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and hi to everyone. Thanks for coming on a holiday. I'm quite impressed. We have a full house here. I don't know how many of you were part of Moritz's lecture last year about the DRX, but the DRX is actually something that I'm not going to focus on too much tonight, because I think you probably already have a bit of an understanding, but I'm trying to explain, or I'm trying to talk a little bit more about my everyday life in the office and the architectural practice as we live it today, and maybe also to which extent it has maybe changed over the years. As you already mentioned, I'm the third generation now of architects. On the top left you can see my grandfather, that's my dad, and that's basically a scene from today in our Berlin studio. And I would say things have changed in the way that we are moving from one mastermind, one master builder, towards a team effort. You can see that on the top left it was pretty much up to my grandfather to come up with a good idea. Everyone else was was waiting for it to happen and to then take that idea and basically and execute it. I would argue that today the result is usually is open. The design process is a non-linear one, and there are many more people involved. This is our team that works in the German and in the Asian offices, and obviously on top of that there's a huge network of collaborators, consultants, and friends and colleagues who have a great influence. Design, research and context, that's the name of the topic of today's lecture. I want to talk about the dynamics between the three. Design is what in the end comes out as a product. That's a building that emerges. The context is something that that we do not just understand in the literal sense, but it can also be a cultural, a political, a social context. And research, in our case, is something that we do not understand in a scientific or in an academic way. It's always oriented or kind of driven from the work that we do, but we still sometimes try to take the time to focus on reoccurring themes and questions. And this is basically a snapshot of the website where you can see the three design, research and context kind of content tiles. They're all equally important, and they inform each other in a way that a design can emerge from a context, or a design can trigger a research. So it's kind of this dynamic between them that drives our everyday work. And I would like to illustrate and talk about that dynamic at the hand of three projects, very different in scale and in type. First one is the Porsche Pavilion. Second one is an innovation center for Merck in Darmstadt, not too far away from here. And the last project is the Haiku Tower in China. I would like to start with Porsche and the building typology of a pavilion, which in itself is something in between a building and an experiment. It's something that is usually temporary. This one was supposed to last longer, but a great vehicle to test things that you usually don't get built. The context in this case was the brand. Everyone knows Porsche. If you're somehow interested in cars, or if you're obsessed with design, then the 911 is kind of like the incarnation of your desire. And when we were commissioned to do this pavilion, we really examined and tried to understand what the core of that brand is. In the brief, we were confronted with these kind of clouds of words that would mean something, but in the end also don't mean anything. You have these contrastive pairs here of tradition and innovation, exclusivity, social acceptance, performance, design, functionality. It all means everything and nothing at the same time. So what we did is we sat together with the client, and this is a team that in our office, it's called the programming team, has nothing to do with computer programming, but it's basically a team that is operating almost before something is handed over to the design studio. So it's kind of like the zero phase, where it's only about thinking and developing concepts and establishing contexts. And they basically, in a one-to-one interview or conversation with someone else, visualize and extract the information and then put them together. So each bit of information is basically on one of these cards, and they then sort of map those cards out and try to filter out the main messages that we then try to somehow translate into more abstract terms in order to inform the design process. So in this case, there were, and we kind of just collaged images and references together from the architecture, from the art world, to kind of visualize and get an understanding of these terms. So the first one was the idea of structure and body, where Porsche as the chassis is something that is kind of surface-based. No, it's not something that has a surface and then something that holds it up, but it's basically it works like a body. The idea of light, that the pavilion should somehow negotiate between the daylight, and on the inside there was supposed to be media presentation, so it's basically like a dark room. So how do you deal with that? The idea of sound, the threshold or the tension between inside and outside. These were all, you could call them mood boards as well. Maybe first attempts to understand how to translate what we first saw as these kind of brand words into something that could help us to develop a design from it. Here this idea of seduction, also that you want to somehow attract people. The idea or question of intimacy, should it be a collective experience, or do you want to be on your own when you experience this car? These very simple skits or sketches started to emerge, where we could already somehow feel that it's not just going to be in a building where you enter and it's one interior space, but we wanted to create this kind of sphere-like in-between space that was half outside and half inside. And the location is in Wolfsburg, in the Volkswagen Autostadt, and the site was right next to the water. So there was also the idea to maybe integrate that somehow. Here you can see the very first studies, shell-like structures, very lightweight, and those structures then started to become a bit more tangible. We started to play with this idea of exterior space becoming interior space. You can see kind of like an opening or a hint of an opening on the top right. The idea that the actual exhibition space could be basically buried in the ground, and that this kind of in-between space would then be something that would basically lead you almost in this processional way up to that moment. And then here the first or more kind of concrete images of what we imagined this thing to look like. And that was all good. So we were kind of happy, Porsche was happy, the brand dudes were all applauding, Mr. Miller, the CEO, liked it. Also all the Porsche designers who we went back and forth with, they were actually quite amazing. We learned so much about curves from them, as I've never learned from anyone else, like how to accelerate and decelerate a proper curve. I don't know, any Maya seminar at Columbia was just bullshit compared to that. So that was kind of like the image that was out there. But the problem was now we had absolutely no idea of how to build it. So we said, okay, like let's reverse the game, and we launched a competition amongst some structural engineers. Some quite well-known ones. It was Arrow, Bureau, Happold, Sobeck, Knippers, and others. And they all came in and presented to us different ways of basically formalizing this now as a structure, and also of formalizing it in terms of material. So there was the whole range from a concrete structure to a grid shell, a wood shell, then here kind of a steel structure. In the end, it was Mike Schleich who made the race. He proposed something really smart that in the end didn't work for fire reasons. He had the idea of basically combining a tension and a compression active system into one. Because on the one hand, you still have this idea of the shell, but the shell is cantilevering, so it's kind of, it's not really what it should be. But anyways, like the choice was made, so he was our man, and we then started thinking of maybe other ways of doing it, and we came across a company that is usually building ships. It's called Central Stahl, and they have done big sculptures with people like Anish Kapoor. And one of our colleagues has already worked with them on another project in Abu Dhabi. And well, we started approaching them, and they said, absolutely no problem, we can do this for you. So we basically decided to go for this option, and we decided to do a monocoque structure, which in a way was very interesting or very intriguing for us, because it combined like the spatial enclosure with the structure. So it's basically what you can see here, the ribs and the surface that encloses it is one kind of force active whole. And they proposed, okay, we can build this in sections in our shipyard in Stralsund, it was, and then basically ship it to your site and assemble it, and that's the end of the story. Maybe I have to mention that what was kind of difficult is that the construction, we only had 1 year to basically from the design to the realization of the building to the opening date. And the Autostadt was in full action. So the construction site could only happen at night. And the main part was basically over winter. So you can imagine the poor construction workers working their nights at crazy temperatures with, I don't know, super high speed. Good. So this is the factory where you can see the big sheets of, it was actually stainless steel, and these big these big tools, no, which basically pressed those sheets into shape. We built mock-ups in the first place, no, to take the Porsche people there and to make sure that the finish of the surface is going to be well enough, no. And it was quite amazing. I mean, these surfaces are double curved, and they only had a tolerance of, I think, 2 millimeters over, you know, these pieces that were the size of what you could still put on a truck. And then, yeah, after a while, we took over that shipyard, and here you can see this army of pieces and sections that they all welded together. And some of the pieces were kind of easier to make. Others, where the curvature was more extreme, were incredibly difficult, and they had to sometimes redo them multiple times in order to get it right. So here you see the assembly then on site. This is one of the sections. This black thing underneath is basically the already insulated concrete shell that houses the interior. And here were the first pieces that were attached, the first cantilevering pieces that were attached to the main body. And you have to imagine that these, like, when a new section was brought into place, they had to basically weld it from the outside and from the inside. And these in-between spaces, I mean, over there, they were still quite large, but in the front part, they were really narrow. So they had to fly in these climber guys from Austria. They were these welding specialists who would basically make their way all the way into that tip to close it off from the inside. Thank God everything went well and they didn't burn themselves. And these are images then of the finished structure, which was for us, and for me it was the very first building that I ever did and finished in my whole life. So for me, the biggest surprise was to see something in real scale that you usually only have on your computer. So you will be, I think that moment when you see your first building realized is so amazing, because you're so overwhelmed by the fact that it's really there. No? And in this case, I was quite amazed that it really looked like the 3D model. It was one-to-one, the same thing. And what was interesting to see how the material kind of behaved and came across and appeared. It was basically the stainless steel, and then they kind of brushed it with stainless steel kind of little balls. So that's what they sort of threw at it after they welded all the pieces together. This is the entrance to the exhibition space, and here you can basically see how it works. So you walk in through that bridge, which then kind of spirals down and kind of like takes you out again. It's kind of organized in a loop. And on the inside you see this kind of swarm of cars dropping down from the ceiling, and they are telling the story. It's basically from their oldest model to the latest one, telling the whole design evolution of the 911. That's a shot of the interior. Initially we tried to do a pavilion without a car, but in the end they won. They said we have to have a car there because people want to sit in that stupid thing. So I don't know. There was no way around it. And these are photographs from the outside. The second project is very different in kind and also in terms of its context. It's for the oldest pharmaceutical company in the world, Merck. They're, in 2017, I think they're celebrating their 350th birthday. And they have their main kind of production site. I wouldn't necessarily call it headquarter, in Darmstadt, not too far away from here. And this is where they have their chemistry and also their pharmaceutical production and brand. And they have grown over the years and grown and grown. But they never really, unlike Novartis or others, have established like a proper face to the outside world. No? So that was their intention now for this big event that's coming up, to say, okay, we want to show our face, and we want to. This is their slogan: living innovation. We want to be forward-looking and up to date. So there was this idea first to build a headquarter, and then that idea changed, and they decided, no, we want to have a building for our people to collaborate and to innovate across the disciplines. They have their biggest problem is that they have so many people, but they have no idea of what the other field or branch is doing. So they wanted to have a building where they can come together in smaller project groups and sort of infiltrate and infect each other. Again, here we had our programming team very close with the client and with the users, and they basically filtered out these kind of main sort of statements, so that they wanted to collaborate, they wanted to be physically connected across the disciplines. Communication was one of the buzzwords that kept reoccurring, but also a place that would somehow suggest that it's okay to do mistakes, to fail. So something that is the opposite probably of like a corporate headquarter, more something where you can experiment, where you feel somehow triggered and engaged. And when you look at the history of office spaces, you basically, at the top left, the early 20s, 30s, you have this open office space, almost in a factory-like kind of like serial condition. Work was passed on. In the 1950s and 60s, the so-called Bürolandschaft was invented. This is actually a drawing of a building of my grandfather. It's the Osram headquarters in Munich. He was the one to first introduce the Bürolandschaft in Germany. It looks kind of as if he was tripping on some kind of drug, but it's actually it was quite innovative for that time. This is an interior shot of the office. The building is still exists in Munich. It's now listed, and this kind of went on then to the cubicles, where you wanted to kind of combine this openness with a sense of privacy. In the 2000s, companies like Google and others brought in the whole kind of fun factor, this idea that it has to be more fun to be at work than to be at home with your family or with your friends, which psychologically and also socially I find, very, very difficult. And then, most recently the trend towards this kind of collaborative approach. And, well, even though there's like a long history, of office buildings in our office, we basically invited people to talk about this whole issue. And this is something that we have, it's called the Henn Academy, where we bring in people from the outside to talk about certain topics, in this case officing. And it was a series of lectures that was quite quite enlightening, I would say, for us. The first one was by Christoph Bartmann. He's running the Goethe Institute in New York, about the life in the office. Quite an ironic take on all these kind of motivation treats that you have these days. But then also clients of ours talking from their perspective, what are the needs and the requirements of their people. This is Hypo and BMW. And we invited Carmen Losman, a filmmaker, the movie Work Hard, Play Hard. I don't know if you've seen that. It's quite shocking, I have to say. And Professor Nazehi was in the office about 2 weeks ago to talk about what we're actually doing after work. And the question is, work these days, is it ever over? No? So this was kind of like the context, the mental context that we set up for ourselves, and then we tried to kind of go back now to this development and to think about the next step. And if you compare these diagrams now to, I think, like the plan that we saw before of the Osram building, there was a clear, I think, need or intention to make it more three-dimensional, that visual connectivity and communication does not happen only on one plane, but that it's basically across multiple levels. This is something that you can, maybe not scientifically, but that we also try to somehow measure. So these are, for example, here studies where we almost beam visual graphs through our 3D models, and we test, in this case, visual connectivity, how visible you are from one place to the to another, and how you can basically, how connected or how disconnected a space can be. And in the case of Merck, we developed multiple options. Now these were then the three that we sort of filtered out also in the dialogue with the client. The first one, and they always had to kind of stand against this, okay, like which is the most communicative, collaborative, and awesome space. So the first one was kind of, looked interesting in the first place, this three-dimensional folded landscape with a central atrium. The problem that we encountered is that these central atriums, they work really nicely in museums or public buildings, but they only connect you visually, but then when you see someone, on the other side and you actually want to approach him, there is the void in between you. So it's more separating than it would connect you. So the second step then was to say, okay, like let's try to break that big void up and have smaller openings. This became almost a bit too, like the idea of orientation, it became too messy and too small in scale. So we in the end said, okay, like we need to kind of occupy the center, and rather than having a void in the center, we have bridge connections and then smaller voids, almost as like little kind of neighborhood voids in between the different work groups. This was a very kind of early study model that still for us serves as the main idea of that building, which is currently in the planning. Yeah, you basically have, it's geometrically, it's very simple. You basically always have these two project platforms that are connected by a bridge, and then they just kind of like rotate, and they're connected through these ramps, or through these staircases. And what was nice about this structure is that this was kind of also like an input from our programming team, that we said we have this almost this gradient of program requirements. Some of the programs had to be more private, and some of the other programs had to be more kind of open and more public. I think this is something that we learned, that you don't want to communicate all the time, but also sometimes you want to sit down and to focus and to concentrate. So these kind of bone-like things almost. Now at the very end, you were most private, and then kind of there was this gradient, now, or this climax in the center where things were most public. No. This is almost now kind of it's a series of programs now that we had to place along this floor plate, and as you can see, towards the center, it is where all the communication spaces, the presentation areas happen, and towards the periphery, you have kind of smaller tables and work groups where people can concentrate and hide away. These are first renderings. We're basically now standing in the very corner. It's always like a double height space now, and we're overlooking a project space in front of us, and then the bridge that connects over to the other side. And then up here is basically two more project spaces that are connected again via that bridge. And we were, in the beginning, we were a little bit scared that the client, Merck, that they would be, I don't know, that they would be a bit shocked, but they really love this concept, and they really, I think, bought into this idea that it's a very multi-layered space that is or could come into being here. This would be the entrance at the bottom, where when you walk into the building, you almost like you have this kind of awareness. You cannot see what's happening, but you can somehow sense and feel that there's something is going on. And this is a view from the outside, from Frankfurter Straße. Good. Let's go to China. The Haiku Tower. Completely different in scale and in terms of the context. It was a competition in 2000 and it's already like 3 years ago now, for a 450-meter high tower in the very south of China on an island called Henn, which we have at that point never been to, nor had we ever done a tower of that height. We were just, I don't know, thrilled to be part of the competition, but again, we didn't really have any clue of how to do it. Here you can see the site. The client was Hainan Airlines, and this was the former airport. So this is the former runway that you can see here. They basically turned the airport into the new CBD, and Hainan Airlines owns pretty much all of it. So this is what it looks like when we went there to see the site. It's like many times in many cases that there's absolutely no context. The only building that was kind of there already was their headquarters. This beautiful structure that you can see here. And well, we went to see them. We were a little bit surprised, and we asked, okay, like, what's up with them? And we found out that they were very, well, they're a big boss in China. You always have a big boss. Is a big Buddhist, and that Buddhism was also something. This is a statue at the very south of the island. That is something that is very present and very important for the local culture there. In any case, like, we started to basically focus on the challenge that we had to do a 450-meter high tower. And yeah, we started looking into what is out there. 450 meters technically is something between super tall and mega tall. So that sounded really interesting. And what we basically tried to do is we tried to kind of almost put together now a matrix of existing buildings, and we tried to study them according to their structure, their kind of program relationships and in terms of their circulation. And yeah, we tried to sort of make sense out of all of that for us. This here is a diagram where you can see different structural systems according to different heights. You can see that everything below 200, 300 meters is kind of like an easy undertaking. Above 300 is where it starts to get tricky. That little thing up there is where the wind also starts to play a big role. So it's not just about the vertical loads, but mainly the horizontal loads that start to become the problem. And we studied that in relation to, other systems that you can find in a skyscraper. Circulation, the core, being also quite an important one. It takes up more than 50% of the area. And also the way different programs were organized. Usually a tower is not just a single or a mono use, but you usually have offices combined with residential or hotel or commercial facilities. So in this, I'm sorry, it's kind of tiny, but in this diagram, we are basically relating. You can also see the little icons for the circulation system, so the essential core versus split core versus eccentric core, and then in relation to the different structural systems, form outrigger versus perimeter structure. And we started to read patterns now in those structures in relation to circulation systems and program arrangements. And that helped us a lot to kind of understand how these machines now, you can almost call them machines because everything is optimized and maxed out, how they would work and how they would operate, and how we could then kind of like use that creatively or actively to come up with a design on our end. With our first ideas, we then went to the London office of Arab and had a workshop. And that was almost like the most important day, I would say, like in the whole competition. Because we were just sitting around a table, and the amazing thing there is that you just have people walking by. So there is the elevator guy, and then there comes the MEP guy, and then there comes the structural guy. This was the moment where the kind of like the economics guy walked in, and he said, "Okay, like, guys, just tell me what are the two programs that you have." And we said we have a hotel at the top, and we have offices at the bottom. And he said, "Okay, like, that's easy. You have to max out your square meters because you can rent them." And at the top where you have the hotel, it's all about the views. No? So you don't want to have any kind of structure in front of your face. And even it was just like a sketch, or a very early kind of moment, but all of these different opinions kind of coinciding and almost becoming then the key diagram of the final tower. So you can see here on the left the office chunk at the bottom, hotel at the top. So we decided to do for the lower part a solid core, which then at the top split into two and created like a central atrium or a central void. And the secondary structure, this kind of diagrid, would, at the moment where the program flipped from office to the hotel, would basically fold inwards, no? So that it would become experienceable from the hotel void, but that you would have free views to the outside. The vertical forces were, so this is kind of like a simple diagram of how the form was generated. So it's kind of like a square, and then as you should try to taper towards the tip for kind of aerodynamic reasons, we basically pushed in the four corners and then had a series of 8 mega columns kind of run along these describing curves now of the tower. And what was interesting then when we we played around with this, it was still like a simple, very conceptual Rhino model, and we turned it into the top view. One of our colleagues from China, he started to smile and he said, "It looks like a lotus flower." And we said, "Yeah, that's right. That's true." And I said, "That's awesome. We have our story all set." No? So from that moment on, the tower was called the Lotus Tower. No, I'm kind of joking, but in China, this is almost like 50% of you can do a really intelligent tower, but no one's going to buy it if you don't have a story to sell it. No. And it's probably like with you, when you present to Johann at the end of the year, you somehow have to seduce him and to build up, some kind of a climax. So this was the tower as it kind of came out. Here you can see the sections in the lower part, the office, and then in the upper part, the hotel. This is a perspective looking into the main entrance hall, which is basically, you have to imagine that the amount of people working in that tower equals the amount of people that go into a soccer stadium. So, and they all come in between. In China, you always have to be on time, so they always come in between 8:45 and 9. So the biggest challenge is to kind of dissect these flows of people and lead them to the right elevators. So you basically have this here on 3 or 4 levels where you try to kind of take those flows apart and then bring the people to their specific flows. And as you see also down here, the tower basically sits on those 8 mega columns that come together in the corners, and also the big diagrid that then hits those corners. So this is basically completely column-free. I think the distance is 55 meters, completely column-free space. Some floor plans of the lower part of the offices. You can see how the tower then transforms from one orientation to the other. And this is the moment that I was talking about before now, where basically the office function changes and becomes the hotel. So you arrive with this express elevator on the lobby level, and then you have this kind of cascading platforms of restaurants and bars and more public amenities, and then on the upper part the actual hotel rooms. Here you can see that the central core then becomes a central void, and this is at the very tip. Also something that we try to do. Usually you have MEP sitting on top of a tower, so we try to keep that all open so that natural daylight could fall into that void. So we submitted this competition, and that's also something in China that is usually very different from here. In Europe, here you have a proper jury and you get a proper report. Over there, everything is kind of mysterious, no? So you don't hear for a long time, and then they come back with some kind of news. These were the other competitors, by the way, or some of them. This was Wilkinson Eyre, So Zaha, and then RJ and some others. And they basically shortlisted, after a public voting, which I think was probably faked, but they shortlisted these guys, Wilkinson, Iyer, and us, to go into the second round of the competition. And they told us, okay, it's not just the second round to refine the design, but they said, okay, instead of 1 tower, we want to have 10 towers. So it was okay, why not? And not only 10 towers, but there was this kind of this hint for the master plan that it should somehow relate to Buddha hand. And yeah, we didn't quite, again, we were a bit speechless and we didn't really know what to do with that. In that sense, our Chinese colleagues were really, really important to kind of mediate, you know, and to kind of explain to us, okay, what is going on in their minds. And what you see here are these different kind of, you know, gestures of the Buddha hand. And we, well, basically started playing with 10 towers. This is a shot from one of the study models, where we just, almost like little kids now, we played around with these towers and we had a lot of fun. And again, maybe looked at it more from you know, the architecture side, but always had this guy in the back of our minds. No? And well, we ended up with a pretty kind of simple, I would say, proposal, you know, where we said, this was the big guy, you know, the one that was already designed. So we said, okay, 2 hands and, I don't know, there's 2 middle fingers, they are the big guys, and then everything else becomes a bit shorter. And where you have the highest towers, the distance is the largest. No? And then as you go shorter, they come closer to each other. And these were then renderings for that second phase of the competition. And it was kind of interesting. Then along the way, there were also talks again with, you know, people who would really understand that culture very well. And something that I, for example, didn't know that with these Buddha statues is that the head is usually overdimensional. If you see it in perfect elevation, like the head is too large for the rest of the body. But this is because these Buddha statues are usually very, very tall, so that when people see them in perspective, the size of the head seems just right. So these were kind of little subtleties that all kind of went into the massing and the refinement of this master plan, and it helped us a lot when we presented it and when we explained it to the client to you know, somehow understand. The problem was that we only had, I think, 6 weeks of time, and we had now a rough massing and the heights of the towers defined, but we now had to design 10 towers, and that's something that is kind of impossible. So we said, okay, let's have our main tower almost like as the father, and then the smaller ones are kind of following a similar logic, but they become more and more regular, and they basically then also create the link or the transition to the rest of the city. That's an elevation of 5 of the towers, and a view of that former runway, which is now going to be the central boulevard of the city of Haiku. That photograph that you saw before, where there's just like a big piece of open land, is probably taken from here somewhere. And well, there's basically this series now of towers, and they are all interconnected above ground and below ground by these kind of undulating commercial plinth buildings. And in front of the buildings there was landscape is something that is usually like a big of great importance. In the sections you can see how they almost form a city, you know, in themselves. You can basically move around from one to the other without ever going outside. I don't know if that's good or bad. We're even connected underneath the streets. And, well, we were lucky enough to win the competition, and then months later we went to Haiku to the client's office for a discussion about the status of the planning. And we walked into his room, and there was a big model of the city, and we always thought, okay, this is probably like a marketing gag for this one Haiku tower now to happen. But they actually had built the 10 towers in the model of the city, so that master plan was actually approved and is in full effect. And we have now just finished design development of the big tower of this guy, and that's supposed to start construction early next year. And just recently, about a month ago, won 2 other towers, ring finger and the little finger, and starting with schematic design for those. So maybe this is an example where it's not so much the context that influences the design, but maybe where the design starts to influence the context, or actually to kind of define the context. And it's interesting to see, and I hope that I could somehow show that in my lectures, that there's always this dynamic in between, and I think it's important that during a design process you're kind of open to all of these forces that are at play. Thank you very much.
You will take some questions?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
I just want to, like, yourselves and work in some air. You were doing findings. I just wonder, can you imagine work in some air? Would they have used iron as well? Is there like construction engineer?
Most likely. But that's something that happens a lot of times, that you have one engineer, and especially with Arab, I mean, being based in London with all these other big firms there, they often take part in a competition with multiple competitors. Yeah, but it's usually different teams. So, yeah, you have to make sure that there's not too much of information flowing from one end to the other.
After the division 1, do you carry on working with the same engineering firm, or how does that work?
Yeah, it was actually Arab who kept working with us until DD, or also through schematic design and design development. And then with a tower above 300 meters height, in China there's a special committee that has to approve that everything holds up. It's a group of like 10 Chinese engineers that are 80 and above. And they have on their end, then on the client side, another structural engineer. In that case it was Thornton Tomasetti from the US, to basically approve that the structure would hold up. And we had big fights and big problems, and Arab was much more, let's say, experimental. and in the end we had to cut down on many things because they were just too stubborn and too playing too safe, basically. But that's also something that in China is just a reality, you know, that it's an emerging kind of field over there, and they are not as advanced, I would say, in the engineering as they would be. It's if you would build a tower in downtown New York, it's a different story.
Before I ask the question, I just want to specify, like this innovation center is like where it's a common space for people to come and meet and to innovate. Like,
Yeah.
from different departments.
Yeah.
Did they get it right?
It's they come, they don't just walk in and see if there's like an interesting idea floating around, but they have these project teams, no? It's almost like a DRX where we sit together and say, okay, like let's you know, do research on minimal surfaces and see if they work with skyscrapers, no? So they come together for a specific topic and for a limited period of time, and then they go back into their you know, departments. But the problem that they have is that they haven't really brought like a pill or something to the market. Like there's usually like a huge development phase, and it costs a lot of money to develop something like an aspirin. It's like billions of euros, and they haven't really kept up with the market. So for them it's really like kind of an urge to say, hey, our people have to exchange ideas and thoughts. And this is hopefully serving as a platform. I mean, you never know. It could also be a complete failure. I don't know.
Yeah, so basically I wanted to ask the way, like, I mean, I think it's a great concept, but did you have any kind of research to, like, did you communicate with these people to ask, like, how is openness and connectivity influences or uses, like, process of innovation or creation?
No, I mean, we had many interviews with the different departments of the company to understand how they work together, to then be able to say, okay, like they work in groups of, I don't know, 20 or 50, no, rather than in groups. It's a different story if it's 500 or 20 people. So there was a very, I think, profound understanding of how they would collaborate now in these groups. But something that was completely up to us is then to translate that into a spatial structure or construct. I mean, you can say, okay, like yes, you want to enable encounter and you want people to communicate, but at the same time you want them to be really focused on their work, no? So there is this whole range now of possibilities in between, and this is one possible outcome now. And I tried to explain that with the tools that we have at hand, we also try to kind of test it, against then the real usage. But it's still speculative. But I mean, as I also said, I mean, I only showed this example of my grandfather. There have been many buildings that also my dad has built in the meanwhile, where we made our experiences, and where in some cases it worked perfectly, in others it maybe didn't work. So this is also something that you take from project to project, and I mean, that's the beauty about architecture, that everything is kind of unique and it's a one-case scenario, and it's not produced as a series. So it's always, you never know. Yeah.
With this project, one thing that stands out is I've never seen with this scale and this multiplicity mirror effect or the symmetry. So I don't know, maybe you can elaborate, because I know about the hand that was the starting point and also the time constraint that was involved. But since it's going to be constructed, more of the effect that it would produce on site if someone is walking in. And
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're never going to be built like that, no. I mean, I mean, you can take it as a massing kind of exercise, no. So the height of the towers and their position, that is something that is part of the master plan, but even the 2 towers that we just won within this master plan, they have changed, for example, the program completely from office to residential. So they will, in terms of their appearance, in terms of their facade, they will look completely different. I'm totally with you, this has something also very scary to it, no? And there's always like a very thin line. But I think this is it's kind of like the 2 things now between like a master plan and like on a master plan level you have to, especially on these gigantic projects, you have to kind of make these very strong statements. I think if it's then at some point designed as a building, it will come out, I think, very differently and somehow I think provide then also like a sense of diversity, you know, within the bigger whole.
I don't have another question. I really appreciate the lecture. I thought it was great work. Also the honesty of basically also saying research as far as it can happen on a project basis. Well, here are some examples. I think also touch in a small way on conversations that we have in a very different setting and an academic one about what, you know, the moment, what is the relationship between formal considerations in a project and or formal considerations in terms of design development, and on the other hand, for us what would be a speculation on language, which I suppose this one is too, it's just that you go to it with a far more experience and also realizing it. So you set up, to make the following observations, for instance, like in the first Monocoque Pavilion, you generate a beautiful, intriguing shell-like form, but then structure comes in as an ad hoc consideration. You basically consult a series of engineers that agree to go into competition with one another, and then you choose that. So it's sort of like a post-specialization of the form on the structural level. So, and then another thing that was also, so I have a question about that, like at what point do you, because you speak about the dynamics between research, context, design, and if you can, with these sort of references, observations that I made from these 3 different projects, if you can just elaborate a little bit on them.
Yeah.
The second one would be, which I very much agree with, you call it the programming. Yeah, but you had didn't call it the group in the office as a program, not a unit. You had a name for it. Group. Pretty sure. So you did the programming to begin with.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you, so basically that becomes a matrix of considerations against which then the architecture develops. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if this would even work. I don't even know if it's. I'm just observing that at the same time right now there are a number of people thinking and speaking about forms of synthesis, you know, bringing as many things together as possible to begin with. And these are, in the three projects, are alternative ways, alternative things that seem to have an a priori, or you can establish a hierarchy of considerations. So with a hierarchy, typically with circulation and structure, and that then becomes a driving thing coupled with programming. So it's very, I find that very intriguing, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on it. How do you go in, how do you decide on what is the a priori thing? Maybe sometimes it's obvious, like in a hierarchy.
Yeah, I think I intentionally chose 3 projects where the a priori force was a very different one, you know? And where, I mean, in the case of Porsche, let's maybe if we talk about the context now. I mean, this is kind of what with the 0 phase now, the programming phase, where we try to set up a context for ourselves. No? So we try to kind of contextualize it in the work that we have done, but not just that, we also try to contextualize it within the larger field of architecture and of the world that we live in. The context in the first project, in the Porsche project, was to do basically a brand pavilion in one big kind of like Autostadt, which is also like a big brand world. So that was pretty much what drove this. It wasn't that we sat down and said, okay, let's take intelligent performance from the brief and make the most efficient shell structure in the world. In the second project, that context was not so much the identity or the brand of the company or the client, or it was also not so much the context or the building typology, but it was much more the process that would take place in the building. So these people and the question how, if you want to kind of create like an innovative office space today, how does that function, how does that work? So again, a very different approach, and structure and form were completely kind of in the second row. And in the beginning, we only thought in kind of organizational diagrams to define that. And in the case of Haiku, the context was clearly not the city, because that's non-existent. It was kind of twofold, I would say here, the context. On the one hand, this context that came in, this kind of more intellectual context of Buddhism and the client and the island and the local culture. But that was never really the driver. Like, we didn't sit down and kind of design a tower like this, but we said, okay, like this is a 450-meter high tower, so we want to engineer this as smart as possible in relation to how program is distributed along its height and how people kind of circulate through the tower. So that's why also I think in the end, formally they come out very, very differently. We don't have the end product in our heads, but it kind of emerges. And to come back to your second question, like what's then the purpose, I think, of this programming phase is really for us, I think, to understand the challenge, and to understand either the need or the requirement of a place or of a client or of the building as such, and to then be able not to make it sexy and highly performative and sustainable, but to really focus, to say, okay, like with this project we really aim to achieve this, and maybe something else is not so important. And I think looking back, we realized that when we really managed to focus on something and to really take that to the max, it was usually more successful than trying to please everyone. Did that somehow answer the question?
Yeah. No, but it's also not so much a question, it's just an observation. Because I stand by my comment in the introduction, and I think it is admirable. Whether it's entertaining DRX in the office, or like you showed here, that you really do investigate a lot in setting up what you call the context. Mm-hmm. And I think it's up for each and everyone to sort of look at the work and say, this I like, this I like.
Yeah. I mean, with the DRX it was, for example, interesting. We almost became tired of doing high-rise competitions. So that we, almost like a burnout syndrome, really. Like after the 10th high-rise, we said, okay, like we need to do something here. And that was a nice, I think, example of how then also practice-triggered research, in a way that we say, okay, like, let's sit down and really experiment with high-rise structures in a context that is completely freed from, a client, where we then look at it from, the perspective of minimal surfaces, or as in last year, vertical net structures. And then something very maybe, prototypical comes out that has nothing to do with this, but there's still, I think, many, many things that we learn and that we can then also feed back into the real world. That for me is always very important. It's also the big difference between what we kind of call research now in our office and what also happens, at universities, is that this is always in very close, I think, contact with the stuff that we do. We're not aiming to be better than you, I mean, at universities, no? Where I think it's just a different focus, no?
Well, that has also been, that has been discussion earlier years ago. Where are we breaking new ground? I think there were opinions that at certain periods it happened in academia and then it shifted basically to a profession. I don't know precisely where it is now, or would have an opinion about it, but still, I mean, I do think it sets up a beautiful dialogue around the idea of research that obviously also can be undertaken very.
Yeah. But what we, for example, experienced that, I mean, and with the DRX, we are basically inviting not only, people who practice, but also professors from universities. So that, and that's what most of them find the most interesting thing, that it's not this either or, but that it's kind of like a combination of the two.
Someone else asked it, maybe I have the last question. It's very pragmatic, but I would imagine that many of us are curious. So how important are the new digital tools for one, the sort of daily work in the office, and then two, for the sort of for your pushing the development of your approach to architecture?
I think they're very, very important. I think they have probably changed in terms of their nature. That, I mean, when I went to school, it was wow to just be able to model something, and that's kind of state of the art these days. So we use the computer a lot to deal with complexities, to things that we cannot really synthesize or synchronize in our heads anymore. When we, for example, looked at there was these communication patterns, of if I go back quickly, for the Merck project, these things here. These are things that, whether they happen now in processing or I don't want to talk about kind of platforms or tools in such a way. It's more like ways of thinking and of dealing with problems and finding methods to solve them. And in that sense, whether that's now visual connectivity, program relationships, or kind of structural feedback, when we design a tower, that is something that has a huge impact, I think, on our daily work. We're still trying to get better at it because there's always the time pressure and this kind of like the reality that hits you. But for example, with I mean, one of the kind of byproducts of the DRX was also, I mean, this is a very tool-heavy undertaking also. So we have looked into how to develop tools that can, kind of like a digital version of what Frei Otto, did with his physical experiments, and how could that kind of feedback directly into the design process. And that's something that is still in its kind of early phases, but we hope to push that, you know, within the office. And our aim is not to then make it to you know, to become like software engineers. For us, it's always that the tool is always like a mean to solve a problem. And it's interesting to see also how, I mean, I don't know how the general kind of feeling here is about it. I mean, when I went to Columbia, everyone was obsessed with these tools and with these possibilities, and people almost, they were exercising these tools for the sake of, almost for the sake of it. And you would be, yes, you would be very impressed, but always left with this question, like, what's the point now, or what's the outcome? And I think that is quite important, that we, with all of these computational things that we have at hand, that are extremely interesting and compelling, and they're great drivers also, you know, to kind of keep renewing your design process. But you always have to, like, don't stop thinking. No? You always have to be with your head one step ahead, and then kind of deploy a tool to get you there more easily or more quickly.
No, it's also interesting because I think there are definitely quite a few actually things happening in response to this digital everything goes type of approach. I don't know if the pure sort of fascination with the digital is one thing, and we begin to ask questions about that, it's probably good. I don't know if the reaction, the sort of more conservative reactions to it are all that healthy either. So I think it re-emerges as an extremely interesting question for what purposes and to what purpose and for what ends do we engage with these tools. This is actually, in this case, then it's actually something that you then take something from and you implement.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, this was in that case actually not Merck, but it was a tower that we did for a newspaper company in Suzhou, where we had these vertical voids, and we basically wanted to test how much of the floor plate and in kind of which manner we need to cut it out in order to provide kind of maximum connectivity. Yeah.
Maybe, as you know, DRX is running on every year basis.
Yes. Yes.
Can you tell something
all I can tell you is that I think we kind of ticked off the structure box, and we now want to focus a bit more on us now, on the human being. I mean, something that we realized also going to all of these conferences is that yes, skyscrapers become these days much more efficient and much more sustainable and lighter and smarter and da-da-da. But in the end, if you look at them, nothing has really changed. No, I mean, it's just like a bunch of stacked slabs. And maybe this motivation also comes from projects like these, that we always want to, people to interact and to, if the future of the cities is a very densified vertical one, then we somehow have to manage, I think, as architects and urban designers, we have to manage to bring in all the qualities that we have in a horizontal city, like a plaza or a stoop or I don't know, something like a sidewalk. We have to manage to bring these qualities into the vertical realm, and that is a question that moves us at the moment. We are not so specific yet that we can kind of pose it almost like as a question or as a thesis. But we are preparing, and this year it won't happen in summer, but it will be in beginning of next year. So it will be in the semester break between the winter and the summer, just because we realize that it is quite complex, and we also in this case want to bring in people from completely different fields.
From all of us, thank you so much.
You're welcome.